how I learned sword fighting as a Gen Z without any skills from zero. So I want to start this video by saying that I'm not perfect. And everything that I'm about to mention inside of this video is what worked for me when I started to learn sword fighting in historical European martial arts. That's something you should keep in mind. And also, of course, I've made lots of mistakes when I went through actual learning progress myself, but also there were a few things that I wouldn't change even in the slightest if I had to restart all over again without any skills, without any knowledge about sword fighting. It was exactly 3 years ago when I started to learn sword fighting in historical European martial arts, and I didn't know how to hold a longsword, how to keep myself balanced in a fencing stance, how to swing my sword properly, how to not make weird movements, even before I actually started to sword fight against other opponents, right? So I had absolutely no idea what I was doing, but at least I was there. Of course, comparing my beginnings to me today, I've already competed in several international Hema tournaments. I trained already with some seriously good fencers in Hema, and I've spent thousands of hours practicing and training inside of this martial art. Of course, mainly with longsword, because that's my favorite weapon. But also I've tackled other sword categories, for example, sword and buckler, and also a bit of rapier with dagger, but mainly longsword. Let's get back to my day one. The step one is how I found Hema. So of course, I didn't discover Hema before I actually stumbled upon it inside of the, just like you right now watching this video, right? And so I didn't realize that such a thing existed, such as historical European martial arts, what I mean. Exactly the sword fighting convention of Hema, right? I knew about Olympic fencing somewhat, and I knew somewhat about Buchut as well. So two ends of the spectrum, basically. But I didn't knew that there was a very cool middle ground between Olympic fencing, which is too sporty, at least for me, and Buchurt, which is all about just smashing without much without much technique, if that makes sense. Smashing your opponent in full harness, which back in the day, at least comparing to right now, I didn't have a physique like this back in the day. So I was kind of skeptical of that thing also. So yeah, I discovered Hema mostly by stumbling upon it on YouTube, but I've been interested in sword fighting from video games as well. Video games was my initial way of introducing me into sword fighting, right? So in general, that's that. So this is quite important what I'm mentioning here, because you as a beginner, you probably don't realize before that there is a thing called historical European martial arts, and there are actual fencers training the historical fencing part of Hema, because Hema is kind of like an umbrella term for anything related to European martial arts, just like it suggests. So for example, boxing, for example, wrestling, for example, dagger fighting as well. It's all a part of Hema, but mainly when someone talks about Hema, just like me, we mainly mean the sword fighting aspect of it. So basically, you probably now had the same idea just like me back then, that you want to learn sword fighting, but you completely don't know where to start, right? And that's completely fine. So why I chose Hema over Olympic fencing, for example, was that Hema is closer to being realistic sword fighting, if that makes sense. So the realism of Hema sword fighting was about, first of all, like the first rule is to not get hit from your opponent, to not get hit by his sword, and to hit your opponent. But if you cannot hold the first rule, then the second rule crumbles, right? So that means that if both of you attack each other at the same time and you connect your swords with with the targets, then both of you kind of like die. So that means it's a double. And a double isn't something that you want to basically experience in real medieval times. So Hema somewhat mimics a real sword fighting duel to the death with sharp swords without any sort of plate armor, so just in civil clothes. The convention of Hema is about hitting your opponent, and you just need to connect one strike to win against him, to win over him, right? But you can't get hit at the same time. It should kind of like mimic a real sword fighting, So if I even undercut my opponent and I avoided his strike, he got cut badly to the arm, for example. So even in a situation when he wants to continue the fight, he has basically no advantage over me. I have an advantage over him because I'm not losing constantly blood and I'm not stressed because of getting hit, and like actually I don't feel pain. So do you know what I mean? That's why Hema lured me in so much, and also because we have cool ass sword categories, for example longsword, right, which is the most popular sword category trained in Hema in general. So eventually I had to find a Hema club for my sword fighting training, right? And I did, in Warsaw. And I was fortunate enough to get into a Hema club which had the best swordsman probably in the entire world who trained Hema professionally. And they were coaches at the same time. They were champions. So yeah, that's something. My first ever training session that I have attended looked like, or specifically what I had to bring to the session, is only a basic sportswear. So basic, t-shirt and shorts with some kind of shoes, right, for running. Nothing more. I didn't have to buy my own gear because the club lended us, so the entire beginner group lended us their own gear. But what gear specifically? A padded sword and a freaking fencing mask. I've been telling you all along that this is the best combination of gear for a complete newcomer or a beginner who wants to actually learn sword fighting, specifically who actually wants to train sword fighting, actually do sword fighting, and not just train technique without anyone, basically, right, by yourself. My training session didn't actually start off with any sort of gear. We started off by just running, just warming up with our coach, and then our coach made us to get into a line, and we trained footwork with him even before we grabbed any sort of gear. So what kind of footwork, you might ask? Just simple shuffle steps forward and simple shuffle steps backwards. So when our coach made a shuffle step backward, we had to follow him with one shuffle step forward. When he decreased the distance towards us with one shuffle step, we had to follow him, or we had to hold the same amount, kind of like a distance, by taking a shuffle step backward. So to follow him and keep the same distance management to him. And yes, footwork and distance management for a beginner is one of the most important aspects that basically a beginner should learn, if that makes sense, even before you actually start swinging a sword. Yes, the next part of our training session was that we had to get into pairs, grab a fencing mask and a padded sword. It was a longsword class, so we had to grab longswords, right? And we got into pairs and we learned technique from our coach, who showed us the example of it a few times. For example, even just a simple strike to the head, so to the fencing mask of our opponent, without much force, but also not just touching his face, not just touching his mask specifically, right? So we had to strike our opponent with the intention to hit, without leaning forwards and without wobbling around, right? So keeping ourselves stable. And then we had to change the roles, and our training partner did the same to us, right? So we just standed there for our opponent to learn that you, as a beginner, have to overcome the fear of hitting another human being. And that's one of the things that no one talks about in the entire Hema environment, because most of the guys who have their own YouTube channels about Hema, they already forgot that beginners have this sort of blockade, let's say, inside of their mind, which makes them to hold their strikes back and actually not finish them entirely. So to actually hit our opponent with the intention to actually strike our opponent with our sword, instead of not doing it with the intention to actually hit, right? We are not just connecting our strike. We have to connect it with force, but not with overwhelming force, if that makes sense, right? By also keeping the proper structure and technique at the same time. So after that, we progressed to how to cover from such a strike. Also, we introduced shuffle steps to our duo drills in class. And then at the very end, you might be surprised, at the very end of the entire session, our coach said that we had around between 5 to 15 minutes of free sparring against anyone we wanted to spar with. That's something which isn't actually common for most of Hema clubs, which I'm completely shocked to hear about, because the best way you can learn sword fighting, or the best way you can learn to implement moves, basic moves into sword fighting, is by learning to max 1, 2, maybe 3 things at a time. So like introducing them to your moveset, max 2 things specifically, and then using them in sparring against other sparring opponents, right? So you cannot just train technique without stress testing it in an actual sword fight. Mistake number 1, which I want you to avoid, but maybe isn't really tied to the things that I've said to you right now, is that thinking sword fighting would look like sword fighting, or the type of sword fighting that you had in your own mind. What I mean is that you probably fantasized about fighting with a sword, doing some sort of weird movement like this, right? Like in some sort of flashy samurai movie, right? The thing is, it doesn't work. You don't learn the principles of sword fighting by doing flashy movement. You'll just get hit with simple actions, because that's the point behind sword fighting. Simple actions are the best one for a beginner to learn and to implement, because your mind doesn't need more things to learn. It basically needs to implement correctly the basic knowledge, the basic movements into your moveset to make the most out of them, and to also learn the principles of sword fighting, such as distance management, such as timing, and such as tempo. If you're a complete newbie, the first thing you should start training actually, or training in a Hema club, is your fencing stance, even without any sort of gear, just getting into a fencing stance. So working on your posture, then working on your footwork, so progressing to footwork, then working on your distance management and on timing as well. Then introducing basic guard, for example, a short guard, right? Short guard is completely like all right for a complete newcomer, if that makes sense, right? You don't need more cool, like, I don't know, guards, which look cool, don't get me wrong, in a movie sense, but at least as a newcomer, just believe me, all you need is a short guard. Or specifically from this position, you can work around into different movements. You can move from this quickly into offense, so striking with the intention to hit, and maybe to cover yourself from striking opponent. So basic cuts, then you get to, of course, to repetition of all of these moves by also repeating sparring. In order for you to at least start learning sword fighting, you have to start with complete basic fundamentals. Just like I said, basic fencing stance, basic movement with footwork, for example, the shuffle step. So it's a short, quick action to reduce the distance towards your opponent, or to increase the distance from your opponent if you want to retreat, while still keeping your sword pointed towards your opponent at the same time. So you need to learn how to walk, how to keep yourself stable, and how to strike with intention before you actually get into your first sparring. But it doesn't mean that you can't start with sparring. So the mistake I want you to avoid is learning more technique before you learn how to move your body. So beginners, or me back in the day when I was just starting out, I wanted all of this fancy shit. I wanted to know how to do all of these fancy maneuvers, such as cool techniques, I don't know, Zwerchhau, or I know, Schildhau, cool disarms, I don't know, cool wrestling also plays, flashy plays basically, right? And of course, historical techniques. But what I had to learn back in the day, and what I had to focus my mind, I had to focus in on balance, on footwork, on simple actions, on simple maneuvers. You don't need to learn a lot of cool things and look as flashy as you do. I mean, looking flashy So knowing how to twirl your sword is a fun thing to do. So like getting in some sort of sword fighting, I know, not really sword fighting, but like sword flow. But learning sword flow doesn't teach you how to behave in a sword fight against sparring opponent. Another mistake that I want you to avoid, so I want to upload into your mind, is avoiding and underestimating sparring. So just like I said in my first training session, I had sparring right away with a padded sword and with a freaking fencing mask. So I already started to do sword fighting after learning simple fundamentals, simple moves, right? And that's everything that I needed to basically know, if that makes sense. Of course, later on, I started to train lunges, I started to train fleches, I started to integrate also a passing step to my moveset. But before all of that, I had to understand that distance matters, that my control of the fight also matters. So I had to balance out my offense with my defense. So knowing how to retreat from my opponent while still threatening him with my sword. And most of all, no one talks about that you as a newcomer and a beginner, you will have, just like me before, you will have a lot of problem with coordination of your eyes, sword and leg movement at the same time. You as a beginner, you have a lot of problems to solve before you get into learning techniques. Does that make sense? You will have an object in front of you with which you can fight, but you have to also understand that the way that you move is far more important than how you like effectively swing your object, so your sword, at least at the very beginning of training, right? And then you will have to understand that your opponent does the same. You would have to hit his body instead of his sword, because his sword doesn't stop being a threat, if that makes sense. His sword is always pointed, or nearly always pointed towards you. He always threatens you with his sword, just like you, right? So you have to get exposed to that pressure. So by exposure to actual sword fighting, you get 5 times quicker results in learning sword fighting. So I want you to remember that sparring isn't some sort of final exam. It's not something to be stressed about, because this is where you have the room to actually learn or enhance your basic fundamental moves and start to fight against different kind of opponents that have different maneuvers that they do themselves, so different actions. So for example, you fight against a more offensive type of guy who always goes with sort of flash into you, right? So in order to win against him, you have to learn that keeping your distance, keeping him a bit more out of distance is better, and also understanding that when he strikes, or you can bait him into striking you when you're just out of distance, that means you have more time to parry riposte back into him right away with your sword. This is a surface level of simple tactics made with simple fundamental movements, and that's why you don't need to learn more techniques. So remember, sparring is what you really need. So you need controlled exposure to the pressure of sword fighting. Believe me. The moment I started to train seriously, it was already 1 year into my training, basically. So I've been attending classes at least 1 time a week, and then I started to come at least 2 times a week to these classes. I started to also train sword and buckler at the same time as longsword, because that was also something that I've been looking for, right? I'm not a great sword and bucklerist, but I always found the combinations of like the category of sword and buckler always fun to watch and to know how to fight with, right? What I wanted to share with you is, after me training for already 1 year and committing more of my focus into actually learning the right way of sword fighting, I started to compete. So my first ever competition that I have attended was actually organized by my Hema club for the beginners. And of course, with padded swords and with fencing mask. We didn't have to buy our own gear. Of course, our coach has been recommending us to buy our own padded gear with a fencing mask, but we didn't have to. We still could just grab their gear for the training sessions, but also for the actual tournament as well. My first ever tournament that I have attended, I competed in 2 categories. So in longsword, in padded longsword, and in padded sword and buckler. So the longsword was and still is, of course, the most popular category out of any in Hema. So we had around 4, I think, groups of guys. So 4 groups of 5 people. And as I recall, I've lost only against 1 guy in my entire group. I think it was 5 guys including me. So I had 4 fights, I think, right? So I had to, I think, win 3 out of 4 fights basically. Of course, after which I've grown a bit of an ego. And of course, I've been eliminated down the line in actual eliminations. And so the thing about the tournament that I've noticed is that all of the things that you've been learning in sparring and in training, comparing sparring to tournament, is that in sparring you have the time and the space to kind of like not fully commit to winning, right? In sparring, you're trying out different techniques if you're already on the level, right? If you're already 1 year into training Hema, remember. So you understand the basics, you understand a bit of more techniques, if that makes sense, and you understand, of course, some sort of tactics. So your moveset and how to use your moveset to win in tactics, right? So even with just simple actions, you can win against your opponent. And in competition, you know for sure that everyone wants to get the best result that they can. So everyone puts their full commitment into actual winning against you. Yes, just like you. So the thing about the sparring and competition, in sparring you can lose. And that's one of the most important things, which I already told you about, is to not avoid sparring, because basically losing in sparring, like at the very beginning, you will always lose against sparring, remember, is one of the most important parts of sword fighting process, if that makes sense. So learning in tournaments, of course, you cannot make mistakes, because if you do, you will lose points. In my first tournament, the head and the torso were for 2 points if you hit it cleanly, and the hands and legs were for 1 point. So basically what I want to tell you, or like a mistake that I want you to avoid, is think that more techniques means more skill. Because in tournaments, you don't need to know all of the techniques there are for longsword, for example, or all of the techniques for sword and buckler. You need to understand how to use effectively all that you already know. So I eventually had to realize that my improvement wasn't tied to my knowledge of all of the techniques there are for longsword. It was tied to how effectively I can implement them in an actual sword fight. That's why I'm always telling you to not being afraid of sparring and getting into sparring as quickly as you can, or specifically as soon as it's safe. So the competition that I attended, it felt entirely different from sparring, because there was much more pressure. So when you have sparring pressure, the competition pressure is another layer on top of it, right? Everyone wants to win. So you cannot not know how to use at least the moveset that you have effectively, right? Or you don't know how to adjust to each and every opponent in such a way to win against him in specific, and not like in general against just one friend. Another mistake that I want you to avoid is growing a weird sort of ego when you're using your time spent in training as how good you actually are, or how good your skill actually is. Competition gives you brutally honest feedback about your performance, and that's very important for someone who's already at least 1 year into training historical Korean martial arts. So what I'm telling you doesn't mean that you don't necessarily need to compete as quickly as possible. That's not what I mean. But eventually you need to attend these sort of situations where your skills are truly tested under pressure. So the next thing I want to tackle is what I would do differently. So if I had to start Hema all over again tomorrow, I'd give myself main 5 rules to follow. The first rule is finding a good club immediately. And if you're not in a position to attend any sort of Hema club, then I highly encourage you to find or create some sort of micro group by encouraging your close ones, by encouraging your friends, by telling them that, hey dude, I want to train sword fighting. Want to join me? I saw this dude on YouTube talking about that anyone can start training Hema, right? With just padded swords and a fencing mask. So let's do this. It's just a simple example. Right? Don't spend 6 months searching for like a perfect YouTube playlist for the beginners who want to start sword fighting. Start doing it today in your own real life, not watching just pixels on the screen. The second rule is get basic gear and start training today. Don't obsess over having the best perfect setup, so the best gear for steel or something that. No, you just need a padded sword and a fencing mask, and maybe a pair of it for your friend as well that you probably recruited to your cause. Rule number 3 is mastering movement before you get into technique. So your footwork, your balance, your simple strikes with the intention to hit, your simple defense with distance and with sword is basically everything that you need to start learning sword fighting the right way. Rule number 4 is I would start sparring as soon as it's safe. You need to learn how to operate under the pressure of sword fighting. So you need that exposure to the actual sword fighting thing, right? Rule number 5, I would train consistently for years. So this is probably the biggest one that you forget about, that you will not become a swordsman or even a decent swordsman in half a year time. No, you will start to become a decent swordsman at least after 1 year of training. I want to grab that weird thought in your head and just pull it out from you, that you don't need to become good after half a year of training. You don't need to become good. You just need to be there. You just need to attend these classes. You just need to meet up with those guys that you're sparring with and basically test your own basic things, basic movements against them. You just need to keep showing up, man. The biggest sort of message that I want to upload into your mind is that you don't need to be talented to start training sword fighting. I wasn't talented at all. Before Hema, I've never touched any sort of sport whatsoever. I haven't been interested in any sort of sport. Starting to train Hema eventually made me to consider joining a gym, committing more of my energy and commitment to actually learning the right movement, right? I haven't started perfectly, and that's the rule. Every moment isn't a perfect moment to start Hema, but it is a moment to start Hema. You need to be willing to be terrible, at least for a while. A thought that always kept me pushing forwards, even when I was losing against everyone in sparring, was that if I just stick to training sword fighting, if I just keep attending these classes, if I still keep sparring against all of the opponents, eventually, not right away, but eventually, I will become a decent swordsman. And today, I am a great swordsman. Right now, I'm helping other beginners to try out and start actually learning sword fighting the right way, just like I did. Of course, trying to avoid all the mistakes that I did before. If you want my own help, if you want to join a community of motivated beginners who just started to train sword fighting or just started to learn about Hema in general, then go and check out my school community called START SWORDFIGHTING. The link in the description and the first pinned comment. This is where I privately help all of the guys who join, and I reach out to everyone who joins this group. If you want my private help, if you want my guidance and the playlist of my guides basically that I've recorded about how to train sword fighting the right way, at least for a beginner to get into intermediate level, then you have to join this community right now. You'll find me in there. And remember, always take the initiative.